The beginning of Nathan's journey at the university was marked by the thrill of independence and the allure of urban life. Nestled in the heart of the bustling city, the campus stretched across blocks with a mix of sleek modern architecture and towering Gothic buildings that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. For Nathan, a first-generation college student, the opportunity to study at one of the country's most prestigious universities felt like stepping into a dream. Or, as he would later reflect, a carefully constructed trap. The first weeks passed in a blur of orientation events, class schedules, and late-night conversations with his assigned dorm mate, Ethan. The university brimmed with energy, yet an unspoken divide loomed between the old and new sections of the campus. The modern side, with its glass-walled lecture halls and contemporary art installations, teemed with students at all hours. The older section, home to the original quad and the looming Hadrian Hall, was eerily quiet by comparison, its ancient stone facades casting long shadows over the cobblestone paths. Nathan's curiosity about Hadrian Hall was piqued during a campus tour. The guide, a cheerful senior, briefly mentioned the building's history as the university's first library, but quickly changed the subject when someone asked why it was no longer in use. "It's being renovated," she had said a little too hastily. The building's boarded-up windows and padlocked doors seemed to tell a different story. That night, Ethan mentioned hearing rumors about the building. Some students say they hear sounds coming from it, like footsteps or whispering. Others think it's just rats. Either way, nobody goes near it after dark. One evening, after a long day of classes, Nathan found himself wandering the quieter side of campus. He hadn't intended to visit Hadrian Hall, but his feet seemed to lead him there. The building stood in stark contrast to its surroundings, its dark stone exterior absorbing the glow of nearby streetlights. A cold wind blew through the quad as Nathan approached, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made him shiver. The air felt heavier here, as though he had stepped into a space that didn't quite belong to the world he knew. As he circled the perimeter, he noticed something odd. One of the lower windows, previously boarded up, had a plank missing. The opening was just large enough to peer through. Cautiously, Nathan leaned in, pressing his face against the cool glass. The room inside was dimly lit by the pale light of the moon filtering through cracks in the wood. Rows of ancient shelves stretched into the darkness, their contents cloaked in thick layers of dust. At the far end of the room, something glinted, a metallic object that seemed out of place amidst the decay. Nathan pulled back quickly, his pulse racing. He wasn't sure what he had expected to see, but the silence on the other side of the window felt oppressive. As he turned to leave, a sudden sound made him freeze, a faint scratching like nails dragging against wood. It was coming from inside the building. Rationalizing it as an animal, Nathan forced himself to walk away, but the sound followed him in his mind, growing louder with every step until it became a cacophony by the time he reached his dorm. Ethan was already there, sprawled on his bed and scrolling through his phone. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smirk. Nathan shrugged it off, blaming the chill of the evening, but his mind lingered on the strange encounter. That night, as he tried to sleep, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching him through that broken window. The next morning, Nathan decided to visit the university archives in the main library, hoping to learn more about Hadrian Hall. The archivist, an elderly man with piercing blue eyes, was less than forthcoming. "Hadrian Hall has been closed for decades," he said curtly when Nathan asked about it. "It's not a subject we like to dwell on." He handed Nathan a dusty folder containing sparse documentation, blueprints, a list of donors, and a single photograph of the building taken during its construction. Nathan noticed something strange about the photograph. Standing in front of the building was a group of people, presumably workers or faculty, but their faces were obscured, as though the film had blurred them intentionally. At the edge of the frame stood a figure Nathan hadn't noticed at first, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to bleed into the background. When he pointed it out, the archivist snatched the photograph back and muttered, "Sometimes the past is better left alone." Despite the archivist's warning, Nathan's fascination with Hadrian Hall only deepened. Over the next few days, he began to notice subtle shifts around campus. Students avoided discussing the building, even when he brought it up casually. The campus tour guides refused to answer his follow-up questions. Even Ethan, who had been so eager to share ghost stories, suddenly changed the subject whenever Hadrian Hall came up. It was as though the entire campus had conspired to erase the building from memory. As the semester unfolded, Nathan resolved to uncover the secrets hidden within Hadrian Hall. What he didn't know was that the building was already aware of his curiosity, and it was waiting for him to return. The mystery of Hadrian Hall lingered in Nathan's mind, but life at the university didn't slow down for his growing obsession. Between his rigorous coursework and the vibrant distractions of city life, Nathan often found himself overwhelmed. However, one professor stood out amidst the chaos. Dr. Klein, an engaging and eccentric figure who taught a freshman seminar on the history of knowledge. His lectures were unlike anything Nathan had experienced. Dr. Klein spoke with an intensity that made every student in the room feel as though they were on the brink of a profound revelation. Dr. Klein had a peculiar habit of going off script. Instead of sticking to the syllabus, he would digress into cryptic anecdotes and half-formed theories about ancient universities, forbidden books, and knowledge too dangerous to be contained. The university, he said during one such tangent, is not just a place of learning. It's a living organism, fed by the minds of those who pass through it. And like any organism, it has its dark corners. Nathan found himself hanging on to every word, but his classmates were less captivated. "He's a nut," Ethan said one night as Nathan recounted the day's lecture. "Half the time, I don't know what he's talking about." Yet there was something in Dr. Klein's voice, an undercurrent of urgency that Nathan couldn't dismiss. One morning, midway through the semester, Nathan arrived early to Dr. Klein's class. The room was unusually empty, with only a few students scattered across the seats. As the clock ticked past the start time, a sense of unease spread. Dr. Klein was never late. By the time the class was dismissed, whispers of concern began to circulate. The next day, Dr. Klein was still absent, and the department sent a substitute. A week passed, then two, with no word from the professor. The university sent an email assuring students that Dr. Klein's classes would continue as scheduled, but the vague tone did little to quell the growing unease. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, especially after overhearing two professors whispering in the hallway. "It's happening again," one said grimly. Nathan's curiosity took over. He began to dig into Dr. Klein's background, but what he found only deepened the mystery. The university's website listed him as a tenured professor, but there were no other records of his work. No published papers, no mentions in academic circles. It was as though Dr. Klein existed solely within the confines of the university. Driven by questions he couldn't answer, Nathan returned to the archives. The elderly archivist, who had been so reluctant to discuss Hadrian Hall, seemed even more on edge when Nathan mentioned Dr. Klein. "You do well to let this go," the man said, his voice low. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened." Before Nathan could protest, the archivist shuffled away, leaving him alone with a stack of dusty files. As Nathan sifted through the documents, a chilling pattern emerged. Over the past 3 decades, several faculty members had disappeared under similarly vague circumstances. None were formally declared missing, yet their absence was quietly accepted. Each case involved professors with unusual areas of expertise: esoteric history, forbidden literature, or fringe sciences. Nathan's pulse quickened when he found a name he recognized: Dr. Harris, a former librarian who had vanished 15 years earlier. A photograph of Dr. Harris, taken outside the library, showed him standing in the same quad where Hadrian Hall loomed in the background. To Nathan's horror, the shadowy silhouette he'd noticed in the earlier photograph appeared here too, barely visible but unmistakable. That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. His thoughts were consumed by the photographs, the archivist's warnings, and the eerie parallels between Dr. Klein and the other vanished faculty. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were restless, a chaotic blur of dark hallways, whispered voices, and the distant sound of scratching. The next morning, Nathan decided to visit Dr. Klein's office. The hallways of the humanities building were eerily quiet as he approached. The door to Dr. Klein's office was ajar, and Nathan hesitated before stepping inside. The room was a mess, paper strewn across the desk, bookshelves half empty, as though someone had left in a hurry. On the desk lay a single piece of paper with a hastily scrawled note. Hadrian Hall is the key. Do not trust the shadows. Nathan's breath caught as the door behind him creaked shut. When he turned, the hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, as though he wasn't alone. With the note clutched tightly in his hand, Nathan realized that whatever had happened to Dr. Klein was only the beginning, and he was already too deep to turn back. The note Nathan found in Dr. Klein's office consumed his thoughts. Hadrian Hall is the key. Do not trust the shadows. The words looped in his mind, a cryptic riddle pulling him deeper into the mystery. But what did it mean? What shadows? And why Hadrian Hall? Of all places? These questions became his obsession, driving him to investigate despite the increasing warnings to stay away. That evening, Nathan shared the note with Ethan, who reacted with predictable skepticism. "You're letting this get to your head," Ethan said, shaking his head as he scrolled through his phone. If Dr. Klein disappeared, the university's covering it up for their own reasons. Big deal. Universities do shady stuff all the time, but Nathan wasn't satisfied with the dismissal. The shadows, the photographs, the scratching sounds near Hadrian Hall, it all felt interconnected, like pieces of a puzzle no one else could see. Desperate for answers, Nathan turned to the internet. Forums, blogs, and subreddits dedicated to urban legends and university scandals revealed surprisingly little about Hadrian Hall. Most posts dismissed it as a haunted building with no concrete evidence to back the claims. But one comment caught his eye. It's not just haunted. It's alive. The hall chooses who it lets in. Nathan's heart raced. The idea was absurd, but it felt uncomfortably close to the truth. He sent a direct message to the user who made the comment, hoping for more information, but hours passed without a response. Just as he was about to give up, a notification popped up. Don't ask questions you're not ready to answer. If you want the truth, visit the clock tower at midnight. Alone, the message filled Nathan with equal parts dread and exhilaration. The clock tower was a campus landmark situated just a block from Hadrian Hall. Students rarely visited it, and rumors claimed the bell hadn't rung in decades. The thought of going alone sent a chill down his spine, but if this was the only way to uncover the truth, he had to try. As the clock neared midnight, Nathan grabbed a flashlight and a notebook and slipped out of the dorm while Ethan slept. The campus was unnervingly quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic muffled by a thick fog that had rolled in. The clock tower loomed ahead, its spire barely visible through the mist. Nathan's footsteps echoed unnaturally on the cobblestones, each step louder than the last. When he reached the tower, he noticed something odd. The door, usually locked, was slightly ajar. He hesitated, his flashlight casting long shadows on the worn wooden door. Summoning his courage, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of damp wood and rusting metal. The interior was sparse, spiraling stairs leading upward, illuminated only by the faint beam of his flashlight. As he ascended, the stairs groaned under his weight, each creak amplifying his sense of unease. Halfway up, Nathan froze. He heard something, a low, guttural sound like a distant growl. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the wall above him. The growl subsided, leaving only the sound of his labored breathing. When he reached the top, Nathan found himself in the clock's inner chamber. The massive gears were rusted and still, their once majestic mechanism frozen in time. On the far wall, a message was scrawled in what looked like ash. "They see you." Beneath it lay a pile of old papers, some torn and yellowed with age. Nathan rifled through them, finding diagrams of Hadrian Hall, lists of names, and notes written in hurried, fragmented sentences. One page stood out, a map of the campus with several locations circled in red. Hadrian Hall, the clock tower, and a few other spots Nathan didn't recognize. Scrawled in the margin were the words, "Convergence points." "They feed here." Feed? On what? Nathan's hands trembled as he stuffed the papers into his bag. As he turned to leave, the growling sound returned. this time louder and closer. Nathan's flashlight flickered violently before plunging him into darkness. Panic set in as he stumbled down the stairs, the growl echoing behind him, growing into a deafening roar. He sprinted the last few steps, bursting through the tower door and into the foggy night. The air outside was thick, oppressive, as though the campus itself was holding its breath. As Nathan looked back at the tower, he saw movement in the upper window, a shadow, humanoid but distorted, staring down at him with unblinking intensity. He froze, the weight of its gaze pressing into him, before his survival instincts kicked in, and he ran. Back in his dorm, Nathan locked the door and collapsed onto his bed, his mind racing. He pulled the papers from his bag, his eyes scanning the frantic notes. "They feed here," the words repeated in his head like a mantra. Whatever had happened at Hadrian Hall wasn't just a ghost story. It was something far older, far darker, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Nathan spent the following day in a haze, the events at the clock tower replaying in his mind like a bad dream. He tried to focus on his classes, but the shadow in the tower's window haunted him. Every dark corner and flickering shadow on campus felt alive, as though the campus itself were watching him. The papers he had retrieved lay hidden in his desk drawer, their cryptic messages taunting him. He knew he couldn't stop now. Whatever they were, he needed to understand the full truth. That evening, Nathan decided to visit one of the other locations circled on the map. It was an unassuming maintenance shed behind the art building, a place he'd passed dozens of times without a second thought. The shed looked abandoned, its faded green, paint peeling, and the hinges on its door rusted. At first glance, it seemed like an odd inclusion in a mystery filled with cryptic messages and supernatural shadows. But the map's insistence nagged at him. Under the cover of darkness, Nathan approached the shed. The campus was unusually quiet again, as if the usual bustle of students and faculty had been swallowed by the eerie calm. With a deep breath, he pulled on the shed's door. It groaned open, revealing a dark interior filled with discarded equipment and a faint, musty smell. His flashlight illuminated shelves cluttered with tools, paint cans, and coils of wiring. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as Nathan swept the light across the floor, he noticed something strange. A patch of dirt in the center of the shed, perfectly circular and devoid of dust, as though it had been disturbed recently. He crouched down, brushing the dirt aside with his hand, revealing a metallic surface beneath. His heart raced as he uncovered what appeared to be a trapdoor, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Nathan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. He gripped the handle and pulled. The trapdoor opened with a groan, revealing a steep staircase leading into darkness. A faint, almost imperceptible hum drifted up from below. Nathan's flashlight beam barely pierced the black void, but he steeled himself and descended. The stairs led to a narrow tunnel lined with crumbling bricks. The hum grew louder with each step, resonating in his chest. The air was thick and damp, carrying an unnatural chill that made his skin crawl. As Nathan ventured deeper, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. In the center of the room was an old desk covered in books and papers, much like the ones he'd found in the clock tower. But these were different, more chaotic, as though whoever had written them had been in a state of panic. Nathan's flashlight landed on a phrase scrawled across multiple pages. The whispers bind them. "Do not listen." Beside the papers was a leather-bound journal. He opened it to find page after page of ramblings about Hadrian Hall and its inhabitants. One entry caught his attention. They are not ghosts. They are echoes, fragments of something that was never human. They anchor themselves to this place through the walls, feeding on those who stray too close to their domain. If you hear them whispering, it's already too late. Nathan's hands trembled as he flipped through the journal. The entries became more fragmented, the handwriting more erratic, until they stopped abruptly. Whoever had written this hadn't finished their story. A chill ran down his spine as he realized why. The journal's author had been silenced. Suddenly, Nathan heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Faint whispers echoing through the tunnel. At first, they were too quiet to understand, like distant voices carried on the wind. But they grew louder, coalescing into words spoken in a language he couldn't understand. The hum he'd heard earlier transformed into a low vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. Panic overtook him as the flashlight flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew deafening, surrounding him, penetrating his thoughts. "Don't listen," the journal had warned, but it was impossible to block them out. The words felt like they were burrowing into his mind, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Nathan stumbled back, clutching the journal as the shadows began to take shape. Dark, writhing forms emerged from the walls, their movements fluid yet grotesque, like smoke given life. They moved closer, their presence suffocating. Nathan felt his legs weaken, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint as the vibrations grew unbearable. Summoning every ounce of strength, Nathan turned and ran, the flashlight barely illuminating the path back to the surface. The whispers pursued him, their voices angry and insistent. By the time he reached the shed, he was gasping for air. He slammed the trapdoor shut and bolted the shed door behind him, collapsing onto the grass outside. For a long moment, Nathan lay there, staring at the night sky. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, an ache in his mind. He clutched the journal tightly, knowing it held answers he wasn't ready to confront. Whatever lurked in the tunnels and walls of the university wasn't just a mystery. It was alive, ancient, and aware of his presence. Nathan realized he couldn't handle this alone. The shadows had already noticed him, and if the journal was right, they wouldn't stop. He needed help, but who could he trust? The university seemed complicit, and his friends wouldn't believe him. But deep down, Nathan knew he didn't have much time. The echoes weren't finished with him, and they never let go. Nathan woke the next morning drenched in sweat, the journal still clutched in his hands. The whispers from the tunnel echoed faintly in his mind, as though they had carved a space within him. He wanted to convince himself it had been a hallucination, but the bruises on his knees from falling in the shed and the dirt on his clothes were proof that it had been all too real. Despite his exhaustion, he spent the morning combing through the journal, desperate for answers. The cryptic warnings about the whispers and the echoes were unnerving, but they also hinted at something larger. One entry described Hadrian Hall as a central node of a web, with other campus locations serving as connection points. The university is a body, and Hadrian is its heart, the entry read. It sounded more metaphorical than literal, but Nathan couldn't ignore the eerie parallels to his own experiences. A knock on his dorm room door startled him. Ethan entered, carrying 2 coffees and wearing a look of concern. "Dude, what's going on with you? You've been acting super weird lately," Ethan said, handing Nathan one of the cups. Nathan hesitated, torn between telling Ethan the truth and protecting him. Finally, he relented, showing Ethan the journal and recounting his encounter in the shed. Ethan's initial reaction was predictable disbelief. "So, you're saying the walls whisper? That there's some kind of, I don't know, evil echo living in the tunnels?" He laughed nervously, but his laughter died when Nathan showed him the map and the crumpled papers. The details were too precise, the warnings too specific to dismiss. "Okay," Ethan finally said, his voice tinged with unease. "Let's say I believe you. What's your plan? You can't just ignore this." Nathan didn't have an answer, but as they pored over the map together, a plan began to take shape. The map's circled locations weren't random. They seemed to form a pattern, radiating out from Hadrian Hall. If Hadrian was the heart, then the other locations might hold more clues about the nature of the network the journal described. Their first stop was the campus library, another circled location. The library was one of the oldest buildings on campus, its Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the modern structure surrounding it. As they stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as though the building itself were aware of their presence. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were listening. They began searching through the archives, focusing on old campus records and urban legends. Hours passed with little to show for their efforts, but finally, Ethan found something, a faded photograph from the 1950s. It depicted a group of men in suits standing in front of Hadrian Hall, their expressions somber. Beneath the photo was a single line of text: founding members of the Concordia Network. The name sent a chill down Nathan's spine. The journal had mentioned a network, but this was the first time he'd seen it explicitly named. "What do you think this Concordia Network is?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan didn't respond. His attention was on the background of the photo, where something strange caught his eye. A faint shadow loomed behind the men, not cast by the sun, but seemingly floating midair. As they continued their search, the whispers returned. Not loud and overwhelming like in the tunnel, but faint and intermittent. Nathan felt them rather than heard them, a prickle at the edge of his senses. He glanced at Ethan, who was rubbing his temples. "Do you hear that?" Nathan asked. Ethan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it's like someone's talking just out of earshot." The whispers grew louder as they moved deeper into the library. It wasn't until they reached a forgotten corner of the archives that they found another clue: a leather-bound book labeled Concordia Protocols. The pages were brittle, filled with cryptic diagrams and annotations in Latin. Neither Nathan nor Ethan could decipher the text, but one diagram stood out: a map of the university, with Hadrian Hall marked as the core. "What the hell is this?" Ethan muttered, tracing the map with his finger. Nathan didn't respond. He was focused on another part of the book, where a single line had been scrawled in English: "The walls are alive. They protect the secrets, but they demand a price." Before they could process the discovery, the temperature in the room plummeted. The whispers intensified, filling the air with a suffocating pressure. Papers scattered, the overhead lights flickered, and a low vibration hummed through the walls. "We need to leave now," Nathan said, grabbing the book. Ethan didn't argue. They sprinted out of the library, the oppressive atmosphere following them until they were outside. Back in their dorm, Nathan and Ethan sat in silence, the Concordia Protocols open between them. "This isn't just a ghost story," Ethan finally said. It's like the whole campus is part of some kind of machine or ritual. But why? And what's it all for?" Nathan didn't have answers, but one thing was clear: the network wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a living, malevolent force, and they were now entangled in its web. Worse, it seemed to know they were getting closer to the truth, and it wasn't going to let them go easily. Nathan and Ethan spent the next day locked in their dorm room, combing through the Concordia Protocols. The cryptic diagrams, handwritten annotations, and strange Latin phrases seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. Ethan attempted to translate what he could with an online tool, but the results were fragmented at best. Words like conduit, binding, and sacrifice stood out, hinting at something far darker than either of them had anticipated. "This isn't just some secret society," Ethan said, his voice tinged with dread. "It's like they're trying to control something. Or maybe feed it?" Nathan didn't respond, his attention fixed on a passage accompanied by an illustration of concentric circles with Hadrian Hall at the center. The passage, hastily scribbled in English, read, "When the core pulses, the echoes thrive. Avoid the vibration." The word pulse triggered a memory. Nathan recalled the deep, rhythmic hum he'd felt in the tunnels beneath the maintenance shed. It hadn't just been sound, it had been something physical, something alive. He glanced at Ethan. "We need to figure out what the pulse is. Maybe it's the key to all of this." The map and the Concordia Protocols offered a new clue: a location labeled Nexus Room within Hadrian Hall. Nathan's heart sank. Hadrian Hall was the last place he wanted to return to after his encounter with the Shadow in the clock tower. But the Nexus Room seemed important. He voiced his concerns, but Ethan, now fully invested, insisted they go. "If this is the source of everything, we need to see it," he argued. Nathan reluctantly agreed. That evening, they approached Hadrian Hall under the cover of darkness. The building loomed ominously, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. The campus seemed even quieter than usual, as though the university itself was holding its breath. Nathan felt the weight of the building's history pressing down on him, the whispers from the previous nights lingering at the edges of his hearing. They entered through a side door Ethan had propped open earlier in the day. The air inside was stale, carrying an unnatural chill. Nathan clutched the Concordia protocols as they navigated the labyrinthine hallways, following the map's directions. The buildings seemed to creak and groan around them, the faint sound of shifting wood and metal making their every step feel like a transgression. The map led them to a locked door in the basement, marked only by a rusted plaque that read "Authorized Personnel Only." Ethan produced a screwdriver from his backpack, jamming it into the lock. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The walls were made of rough stone, and the faint hum Nathan had felt in the tunnels was back, growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a cavernous room lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The floor was made of smooth, black stone, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. At the center of the room was a massive, circular platform. It pulsed faintly, emitting the same vibration Nathan had felt before. "This has to be it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. The platform was surrounded by strange machines, their blinking lights and whirring mechanisms out of place in the otherwise ancient-looking room. On one of the machines was a screen displaying a single phrase, "Pulse stable." Nathan approached the platform cautiously. As he neared it, the vibrations intensified, making his chest tighten. The patterns on the floor seemed to ripple outward from the platform, as though the stone itself were alive. He reached out to touch it, but Ethan grabbed his arm. "Don't," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We don't know what it'll do." Before Nathan could respond, the hum deepened, resonating through the room like a heartbeat. The lights flickered, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than ever. The air grew dense, pressing against them from all sides. Shadows emerged from the walls, their forms more distinct and humanoid than before. Nathan and Ethan froze as the shadows moved closer, their eyeless faces seeming to study them. One of the shadows reached for Nathan, its hand elongating unnaturally. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the platform. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out all other sound. "Get back to the stairs," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Nathan bolted, Ethan close behind. The shadows surged forward, their movements faster and more purposeful. One of them lashed out, grazing Nathan's arm. A cold, searing pain shot through him, leaving a deep bruise that seemed to spread unnaturally fast. They scrambled up the staircase, slamming the door shut behind them. The whispers faded, but the hum persisted, a faint reminder of what they had just encountered. Back in their dorm, Nathan examined his arm in the bathroom mirror. The bruise had turned black, the skin around it mottled and gray. It didn't look like any injury he'd ever seen before. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Nathan didn't answer. He had a sinking feeling that the Concordia network had succeeded in binding whatever force they had discovered. And now that he and Ethan had intruded, they were part of the network too. The pulse wasn't just a mechanism. It was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the bruise on his arm as Ethan paced the room, mumbling to himself. The bruise had worsened overnight, spreading up his shoulder in jagged, vein-like patterns. The once blackened skin now shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though something beneath it pulsed in rhythm with the vibrations they had felt in the Nexus room. He hadn't told Ethan about the odd sensation, like faint whispers crawling under his skin, but he suspected his friend could sense the growing weight of their predicament. Ethan slammed his fist on the desk. "We can't just sit here. You're getting worse. And that thing in the Nexus room isn't going to stop whatever it's doing. We need help." "Help from who?" Nathan snapped. His exhaustion had boiled into frustration. "The campus police? A doctor? How do we explain this without sounding insane? We're on our own, Ethan." He regretted his tone the moment Ethan's expression fell. But before he could apologize, Ethan grabbed the Concordia protocols and started flipping through its brutal pages. "Someone had to have dealt with this before," Ethan muttered. "There's too much in here for this to just be an isolated thing. There has to be, I don't know, a solution, a warning, something." He pointed to a passage in Latin that he had partially translated earlier. "The marked must confront the core to sever the bond, or the whispers will claim them." Nathan shivered. The phrase was ominous, and the word marked felt too close to home. Confront the core, he repeated. What does that even mean? The Nexus room? The Pulse? That place almost killed us. Ethan looked up, his face grim. It means we have to go back, but not unprepared. He began listing supplies they might need. Flashlights, a crowbar, anything to defend themselves. But Nathan's mind drifted to the strange machines surrounding the platform. The Concordia protocols had described the core as both a conduit and a prison. But if they were to sever its hold, they needed to understand what they were up against. The next day, armed with backpacks stuffed with tools and snacks, they returned to Hadrian Hall. The air around the building felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Nathan's arm throbbed with every step closer, and the faint shimmer beneath his skin grew more pronounced. This place feels different, Ethan whispered. Like it's watching us? They descended the basement staircase cautiously, the memory of the shadows fresh in their minds. This time, the room was darker, and the machines around the platform emitted erratic beeping sounds. The vibration in the air was stronger, almost suffocating. Nathan felt it resonate in his chest, his arm burning as if in response. Ethan approached one of the machines, squinting at the screen. These readings, they're fluctuating. It's like whatever's powering this thing is getting unstable. He glanced at Nathan. Maybe the core is weakening, but why? Before Nathan could reply, a deep rumble shook the room. The platform in the center pulsed violently, sending waves of energy across the etched floor. The patterns on the stone glowed faintly, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. Shadows emerged from the walls, their forms less ethereal and more corporeal this time. They didn't hesitate, rushing toward the two intruders. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the nearest shadow. It recoiled, writhing as if in pain, but others closed in from all sides. Nathan swung a crowbar, the metal passing through one of the shadows like smoke, but the entity recoiled nonetheless, as if the intent behind the attack mattered more than the weapon itself. As they fought off the advancing shadows, Nathan's arm erupted in searing pain. He fell to his knees, clutching the mark. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't in the Nexus room anymore. Instead, he stood in a dark void, surrounded by the faint outlines of figures. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their whispers filled his mind. One figure stepped forward, its voice distinct among the others. "You bear the mark," it said, its tone almost reverent. "You must fulfill the cycle." Nathan gasped as the vision faded, his surroundings snapping back into focus. The shadows had paused their attack, hovering at the edges of the room as though waiting for something. Ethan rushed to his side, gripping his shoulders. "What happened? Are you okay?" Nathan struggled to find the words. They spoke to me. They said I have to fulfill the cycle." He looked at Ethan, panic rising in his chest. What if the mark isn't just a curse? What if it's a command? Ethan shook his head. "We're not letting them turn you into whatever they want. There has to be another way." He pulled Nathan to his feet and gestured toward the machines. "If we can disrupt whatever's powering the core, maybe we can stop this." With no better option, they worked frantically, smashing wires and prying open panels. Each strike made the shadows writhe and retreat, but the platform continued to pulse, its glow intensifying. Nathan's arm burned hotter with each passing moment, the whispers in his head growing louder. Finally, one of the machines sparked violently, and the hum in the room faltered. The platform's glow dimmed, and the shadows recoiled further, their forms flickering. But before they could celebrate, the room trembled violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The platform cracked open, and a blinding light erupted from within. Nathan and Ethan were thrown backward, their ears ringing. As the light subsided, a figure stood atop the fractured platform, a being of shadow and light, its form impossibly tall and fluid. It turned its glowing eyes toward Nathan, and for the first time, the whispers resolved into a single, chilling voice. "You cannot break the cycle. You are bound to it." Nathan's heart sank as the figure began to descend, each step reverberating through the room. Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the stairs. "Run," he shouted, but Nathan hesitated, the mark on his arm pulling him back toward the platform. Something deep inside him whispered that running wouldn't be enough to escape. Nathan stumbled up the staircase, Ethan's grip firm on his arm, but each step felt heavier than the last. The mark on his arm throbbed like a second heartbeat, a searing reminder of the entity they had awoken. Behind them, the sounds of the Nexus room morphed into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint echo of the entity's steps. The air was electric with the sense that they weren't fleeing fast enough. By the time they burst into the main hallway of Hadrian Hall, they were both gasping for breath. Ethan slammed the heavy basement door behind them, leaning against it as if the wood alone could hold back whatever was below. "We need to seal this place off," he panted. "Or, no, we need to get off campus entirely." "Nathan, are you listening?" Nathan wasn't. He stared at his arm, horrified by what he saw. The dark veins had spread up his neck, creeping toward his jawline. His skin shimmered faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights. Worse still, he could hear the whispers clearly now, no longer muffled but speaking in a coherent, unified voice. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are part of the cycle. Nathan." Ethan's voice was sharp, pulling him from the trance. "What's wrong?" Nathan raised his arm. "It's spreading." His voice was barely a whisper. I think it's alive." Ethan's face paled. "We'll figure it out. There's still time. We just need." His words were cut off as the door behind them rattled violently. Both men jumped back, staring as the wood began to splinter. Something was pushing from the other side, and it wasn't in any rush. Each deliberate strike against the door seemed calculated, purposeful. Without another word, they turned and ran, weaving through the maze of hallways. Nathan's vision blurred as the whispers intensified. They weren't just speaking now. They were commanding. "Return. Accept your role." The words echoed in his skull, making it hard to focus. Ethan led the way, throwing open the building's front doors and pulling Nathan into the cool night air. The campus was quiet, the sprawling quad eerily empty. The sounds of the city were distant, muffled, as if the university existed in its own pocket of reality. Nathan looked over his shoulder, expecting to see the entity emerging from Hadrian Hall, but the doorway stood empty. The only movement was the faint flicker of a street lamp. Ethan grabbed Nathan by the shoulders, forcing him to focus. "We need to call anyone. There's got to be a professor, a researcher, someone who knows more about this Nexus room, the core, all of it, who's going to believe us." Nathan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "We don't even know what we're dealing with." Ethan hesitated but pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "Dr. Lacey. She specializes in ancient rituals and cryptic texts. She might have some idea." Nathan didn't have the energy to argue. As Ethan made the call, he leaned against a nearby bench, trying to steady his breathing. The mark burned hotter, and he felt a pull, an almost physical force drawing him back toward Hadrian Hall. He clenched his fists, fighting the compulsion. The whispers grew louder, angrier. "You are bound. You cannot defy us." Ethan ended the call and turned back to him. "She's in her office. She said she'd wait for us." He hesitated, noticing Nathan's pale face. "Are you okay? You look like you're about to pass out." "I'm fine," Nathan lied, even as his vision swam. The whispers didn't relent, their voices clashing against his thoughts. He nodded toward the Humanities building. "Let's just go." Dr. Lacey's office was tucked away on the 3rd floor, surrounded by shelves crammed with old tomes and artifacts. She was a tall, imposing woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to weigh their every word. She listened as Ethan explained everything: the Nexus room, the mark, the shadows, and the entity. Nathan stayed silent, his focus on keeping the whispers at bay. When Ethan finished, Dr. Lacey leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "You've stumbled into something ancient," she said finally. The Nexus room wasn't just a place of research, it was a threshold. Those who built it sought to harness its power, but ended up creating a conduit for something far worse. Nathan swallowed hard. "What about the mark? What does it mean?" Dr. Lacey's gaze lingered on his arm, her eyes narrowing at the shimmering veins. The mark is a connection, a tether. It binds you to the core, to whatever entity resides within it. As long as the core exists, the mark will spread. Eventually, she trailed off, her expression darkening. Eventually what? Ethan pressed. She sighed. Eventually, it will consume you. You'll become a vessel, a gateway for the entity to fully manifest in this world. Nathan's stomach churned. There has to be a way to stop it. Dr. Lacey hesitated. Destroying the core might sever the connection, but doing so could have unpredictable consequences. The Nexus Room was designed to contain the entity. If you destabilize it without understanding the full scope, you could unleash something far worse. Ethan paced the room, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Sit around and wait for it to kill Nathan? Dr. Lacey glanced at the Concordia protocols on the desk. The answer might be in there. This text was written by those who encountered the core before. It's incomplete. But if you can find the missing pages, you might learn how they stopped it. Missing pages? Nathan asked, his voice shaking. Where are they? She leaned forward, her expression grave. Rumor has it they were hidden in the campus library's restricted archives. But if the mark is already affecting you, I suggest you move quickly. Time is not on your side. The shadows outside the window seemed to deepen as her words hung in the air. The university library was an imposing monolith of glass and steel, standing silent and foreboding against the backdrop of the city's shimmering skyline. Nathan and Ethan approached its towering doors, their footsteps muffled on the deserted quad. Though the library officially closed at midnight, Dr. Lacey had provided a key card granting them access to the restricted archives. Nathan hesitated on the threshold, his arms still throbbing with the eerie pulse of the mark. The whispers had grown quieter, but more sinister, their words dripping with malice. They cannot save you. We are eternal. He clenched his jaw and followed Ethan inside, the heavy doors sealing them in with a resounding thunk. Inside, the library was unnaturally still, the usual hum of fluorescent lights replaced by an oppressive silence. Rows of books stretched into the darkness, their spines like sentinels guarding secrets long forgotten. The smell of aged paper and varnished wood clung to the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang Nathan had come to associate with the Nexus Room. Ethan consulted a small map provided by Dr. Lacey. The restricted section is in the lower level, behind the main archives. It's locked, but the key card should get us in. His voice echoed faintly, unnerving in the emptiness. As they descended the staircase, Nathan's unease grew. The mark burned hotter, and he felt an odd pull, not just toward the restricted section, but toward something deeper, something primal lurking below. He said nothing, unwilling to alarm Ethan, who was already pale and fidgeting with the map. The restricted archives were hidden behind a set of iron gates adorned with intricate engravings of mythological creatures. Ethan swiped the key card, and the gates creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with old shelves. Dust motes danced in the dim light of a single bulb, casting long, flickering shadows. This is it, Ethan whispered, stepping inside. He ran his fingers along the spines of the ancient volumes, their titles written in faded Latin and archaic symbols. Nathan followed, his gaze darting nervously. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, almost alive. The mark on his arm throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the whispers returned with renewed intensity. Turn back. The truth will break you. Ethan pulled a leather-bound tome from a high shelf and flipped through its brittle pages. This looks promising, something about thresholds and dimensional seals. But it's not complete. He handed it to Nathan, who struggled to focus on the illegible script as his vision blurred. Look for anything mentioning the Concordia protocols, Ethan continued, sifting through another shelf. The faint hum of the light above grew louder, almost deafening, and Nathan realized it wasn't the bulb. It was coming from deeper within the archives. I'll check further in, Nathan muttered, compelled to follow the hum despite his better judgment. Ethan glanced at him, but nodded, engrossed in the fragile texts. Nathan ventured into the far end of the restricted section, where the shelves grew narrower and the air colder. The hum grew louder with each step, vibrating through his chest. He stopped at a shelf filled with unmarked black tomes. One of them seemed to call to him, its presence radiating a faint, otherworldly glow. His hand moved on its own, pulling the book free. The instant he opened it, a shockwave of cold shot through his body, and the whispers screamed in unison. "Do not!" His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the shelf, clutching the book as images flooded his mind. He saw glimpses of the Nexus Room, the core, and figures cloaked in shadows performing rituals. Then he saw himself, consumed by the mark, his body hollow and glowing with unnatural light as the entity took full control. "Nathan!" Ethan's voice broke through the onslaught, and Nathan snapped back to reality. Ethan was at his side, helping him to his feet. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I think I found something," Nathan gasped, holding up the black tome. Its glow had faded, but its presence was heavy in his hands. "This book, it's connected to the core. I saw things." Ethan frowned, but didn't press further. "Let's take it back to Dr. Lacey. Maybe she can make sense of it." As they turned to leave, the hum abruptly stopped, plunging the archives into an unsettling silence. The shadows seemed to lengthen, shifting unnaturally. Nathan froze, his grip tightening on the book. From the far corner of the room, a figure emerged, a tall, distorted silhouette with eyes that glowed like molten gold. It didn't move, but exuded a presence so overwhelming that Nathan felt his knees weaken again. The whispers returned, triumphant and cruel. "You cannot escape. The path is set. Run," Ethan whispered, pulling Nathan toward the gate. The figure watched them, unmoving. As they fled the archives, the black tome clutched tightly in Nathan's hands. The iron gates slammed shut behind them, but the oppressive weight of the figure's gaze lingered, haunting their retreat. As they stumbled back into the main library, Nathan glanced down at the book. A new mark had appeared on its cover, one that matched the spreading veins on his arm. The sound of their frantic footsteps echoed down the dark corridors of the university, a rhythm of desperation that matched the thunderous beating of Nathan's heart. His hand still clutched the black tome, its weight pressing down on him with an almost tangible force. Every instinct screamed at him to throw it away, to rid himself of its presence before it consumed him entirely. Yet, as they made their way out of the library, he couldn't bring himself to part with it. The book had revealed something important. He just couldn't quite understand it. Ethan was beside him, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. He said nothing, but Nathan could feel the weight of his concern, his silent fear that had begun to mirror his own. The mark on Nathan's arm burned again, its presence growing stronger with every step they took toward the university's exit. Something was coming, something inevitable, and there was no stopping it. When they reached the safety of the dimly lit quad, Nathan paused, looking up at the sky. It was as if the city had grown quieter since they entered the library, as though even the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A chill ran down his spine, and the whispers, those insidious whispers, returned with renewed fervor. "You cannot hide from the truth, Nathan. It is already within you." The words echoed in his mind, rattling the very core of his being. "Let's go," Ethan urged, his voice shaky. "We can't stay here." Nathan nodded, though he felt as if he were walking through a fog, disoriented, disconnected from everything around him. The university campus, usually teeming with life, seemed almost unreal, like a faded memory. He glanced down at the tome again, the strange symbol on its cover pulsing faintly in time with his heartbeat. Inside his dorm room, Nathan shut the door behind them with a force that felt almost too much for the frame. He could barely remember how he got there, but the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The room felt foreign now, a hollow shell, as if the space itself had been twisted by the knowledge contained in the book. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he could feel the weight of the mark on his arm, a constant reminder of something dark and powerful that was claiming him piece by piece. Ethan sat at the edge of Nathan's bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What did you see in that book, Nathan? What's going on with you? You've changed since that night in the Nexus room." "I can't explain it, but something's wrong." Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the black tome, the ancient pages crackling as they fell open to a chapter marked in crimson ink. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the text. It was an incantation, written in a language that made no sense, yet felt strangely familiar. The words seemed to dance before his eyes, shifting and rearranging themselves, as though they were trying to convey a meaning that could not be captured in language alone. "I saw the Nexus," Nathan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He spoke as though the words themselves were dangerous, as though saying them aloud might unlock something even darker. "I saw it, Ethan. The core, and the people who were there before. The rituals they performed, it's all part of something bigger, something ancient, and it's tied to me." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What do you mean, tied to you?" "Nathan, you're scaring me. You're not making sense. We need to take this to Dr. Lacey. She'll know how to help." But Nathan shook his head, the words suddenly feeling like the wrong answer. "No," he thought, his pulse quickening. "The truth isn't something you can just share. It's something that owns you." The whispers grew louder in his mind, a cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm him. "You were chosen. You cannot undo what has already begun." Ethan stood up, pacing nervously in the cramped space. "Nathan, listen to me. You're not yourself anymore. You need help. Whatever you saw in that room, whatever that book did to you, it's not you. It can't be." Nathan wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that he was right, that it wasn't him, that he hadn't chosen this path. But the words stuck in his throat, as if they were being smothered by the weight of the truth he could no longer escape. The mark on his arm was burning hotter now, and he felt as if his skin was being pulled from the inside out, as if something was clawing to get out. Suddenly, the door to the dorm room creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Nathan didn't need to look to know who it was. Dr. Lacey stood in the doorway, her presence commanding yet oddly serene, as though she had anticipated everything that was unfolding. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and measured. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that whatever was about to happen could not be avoided. The truth, whatever it was, had already taken hold, and it would not let go. As Dr. Lacey stepped further into the room, Nathan felt a cold sense of inevitability wash over him. The path ahead was set, and there was no turning back. "We've been waiting for you, Nathan," she said softly as the door clicked shut behind her. Nathan stood frozen, a sense of dread gripping him as Dr. Lacey's words reverberated in the small room. "We've been waiting for you," she had said, and somehow those words felt both ominous and relieving. Ominous, because they hinted at something deeper, something sinister that Nathan had barely begun to understand. Relieving, because for the first time since that night in the Nexus room, it felt like anyone knew what he was going through. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew that the answers would not come without a cost. Dr. Lacey's presence seemed to fill the room, casting a shadow that Nathan couldn't shake. Her calm demeanor, her practiced poise, contrasted sharply with the chaos inside his mind. The whispers that had plagued him since that first encounter in the Nexus room were quiet now, but they simmered beneath the surface, threatening to rise again. He could feel them, like a storm building on the horizon, their power growing stronger with each passing second. Ethan stood by the window, his body tense, eyes darting back and forth between Nathan and Dr. Lacey. He said nothing, but his unease was palpable. He could sense the weight of this moment, the suffocating pressure that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You've been struggling," Dr. Lacey continued, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. "Ever since you found the book, haven't you? The mark on your arm, the way the truth has started to unravel. It's all connected, Nathan." Nathan swallowed, his mouth dry. His heart was hammering in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't speak. His gaze shifted to the black tome still clutched tightly in his hands. The pages were worn, the cover almost slick with his sweat. How had he gotten to this point? How had something as simple as a book dragged him into this nightmare? The Nexus room was just the beginning. Dr. Lacey continued, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to peer through him. That room, that space, it's a threshold, Nathan. A place between worlds. It's not just some ancient, forgotten ritual site. It's a doorway. A doorway to a power you can't even begin to comprehend. The idea that the Nexus room was not just a relic, but a doorway hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of it, but it was like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. A doorway to what? Nathan finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The question felt both futile and necessary, as if asking it was the only way he could begin to understand the horror that was unfolding before him. Dr. Lacey stepped closer, her face grim. To the other side, a place where the laws of reality do not apply, where time, space, and identity blur into something different. That's where the book comes in. It's not just a collection of symbols or spells. It's a map, Nathan, a map to the other side, and you're already walking the path. Nathan felt a chill creep down his spine. His mind raced to connect the dots, but the answers eluded him. The mark on his arm burned again, a sharp reminder that whatever was happening, it wasn't something he could escape. It was like he was already too far gone, too far down the rabbit hole to turn back. I don't understand, Nathan said, his voice shaky. Why me? Why is this happening to me? Dr. Lacey's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she almost looked sympathetic. Because you were chosen, Nathan. The Nexus room chose you. It saw something in you, something that made you the right vessel. You are connected to this power in ways that you can't even begin to fathom. And now, there's no going back. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Nathan felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of his neck as the weight of her revelation sank in. Chosen. Vessel. What did that even mean? What kind of power was he connected to? And how could he ever break free from it? Ethan moved toward Nathan, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. What are we supposed to do, Dr. Lacey? How do we stop this before it gets any worse? Dr. Lacey's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at Ethan, then back at Nathan. You can't stop it, not now. The path is already set. The only thing you can do is to understand it. You need to learn about the other side, Nathan, and you need to understand what it wants from you. That's the only way you'll survive what's coming. Nathan's mind reeled as the implications of her words sank in. Survive? Was this something he could survive? The whispers were getting louder now, swirling in the corners of his mind like a storm, urging him forward. You are the key. The time has come to open the door. He could hear them more clearly now, their voices melding together in a maddening chorus. But what was on the other side? What was waiting for him? Nathan couldn't fathom it, couldn't bring himself to imagine the horrors that lay beyond that threshold. Yet deep down, he knew that he couldn't turn away. The pull was too strong, the mark on his arm too insistent. The answers were there, on the other side, waiting to be uncovered. As the silence stretched between them, Dr. Lacey turned toward the door. I'll give you some time to prepare, Nathan. But remember, time is running out. The door is already opening. And once it's fully open, there will be no going back. With that, she left, leaving Nathan and Ethan alone in the dimly lit room. Nathan's heart was racing, his thoughts tangled in a web of fear and uncertainty. The door to the other side was opening. The question was he ready to face what lay beyond? Nathan sat alone in the small room, his hands trembling as he gripped the book. Dr. Lacey's departure had left a void in the air, a sense of finality hanging over him. His mind kept cycling through the same thoughts. The other side, the Nexus room, the mark on his arm. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, like he was being pulled along by an unseen force that was more powerful than his will to resist. The weight of Dr. Lacey's words still echoed in his mind. The path is already set. He wondered if there was any way he could have stopped this, any way he could turn back. But the deeper he thought about it, the more he realized that the answer was clear. There was no turning back. He had already crossed the threshold when he first set foot in the Nexus room. That place had drawn him in, had marked him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Now it seemed to be dragging him towards something bigger, something that he couldn't control. And there was no way to stop it. The whispers, once faint and sporadic, were growing louder. They no longer felt like distant murmurs in his mind, but like a chorus of voices closing in, urging him forward. Nathan tried to block them out, to focus on the present, but it was impossible. They were insistent, relentless. "You are the key. Open the door. Open the door." Ethan had left after Dr. Lacey's meeting, his own face a mixture of confusion and concern. He had wanted to stay, to figure out how they could stop whatever was coming, but Nathan had insisted that he needed to be alone. There was too much to process, too much to understand. And as much as he cared for Ethan, this was something Nathan needed to face on his own. The hours passed, though Nathan didn't know how many. The darkness outside the window grew deeper, and the room seemed to close in around him. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though something was pushing against him from all sides. It was becoming harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. He could hear the whispers more distinctly now, as though they were coming from just behind him. He dared not turn around. Instead, Nathan turned his attention to the book. Its pages, though seemingly just ink and paper, felt alive in his hands. The symbols on each page seemed to shift, to pulse with an energy of their own. Every time he tried to focus on a single page, the words would blur and move, as though they were refusing to be understood. But somehow, he knew that the answers were hidden within these pages. He just had to uncover them. It wasn't until the book fell open to a new page that Nathan felt a surge of recognition. The symbols on the page were different now. They weren't like the others he had seen. These seemed more detailed, more intricate. And as his eyes scanned them, something clicked. He understood, or at least he thought he did. The words, if they could be called that, seemed to describe something important. The translation was unclear, but Nathan could make out enough to know that they were referring to a specific time. A moment of transition. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his arm. It was as if the mark on his skin had come alive, burning fiercely, and Nathan gasped in pain. The whispers, too, were deafening now, a cacophony of voices shouting in his ears. He dropped the book, clutching his arm in agony, his vision blurring as the pain intensified. He fell to the floor, his body racked with tremors, and the world around him began to warp and twist. This is it, Nathan thought, as the pain reached its peak. The threshold was here. The door was opening. The room around him seemed to dissolve. The walls blurred, and the air felt thick with pressure, like the very fabric of reality was bending. He could no longer tell what was real. The whispers were no longer voices in his mind, but sounds in the room itself. The light flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. Something was happening, something he couldn't control. And then the air stilled, the whispers faded, and the pain in his arm began to subside. Nathan blinked, his vision returning, though the room still felt off. It was as though the laws of physics no longer applied. The air was different now, heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. His heart raced in his chest, and the mark on his arm still burned, but now there was something else, something more. He slowly stood up, his legs unsteady, and turned toward the corner of the room where he felt a presence. At first, it was just a sensation, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. But then Nathan saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the shadows. The figure was tall, its outline blurry, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. The shape was vaguely human, but its features were indistinct, like something caught between two realities. Nathan couldn't move, couldn't speak, as he stared at the figure. It was watching him, and in that moment, Nathan understood. This wasn't just a dream, and it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. The other side had opened, and whatever was standing in front of him, it wasn't human. The whispers returned, now clear and urgent. "It is time. You must go." Nathan wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, and the world around Nathan seemed to shrink. He was no longer in the room, no longer in the university. He was standing on the edge of something vast, something ancient. The threshold had been crossed. There was no turning back. Nathan's mind screamed for answers, for some way to understand what was happening. But all he could do was stand there, paralyzed by the enormity of it all. The other side had opened, and now it was pulling him in. The figure that stood before Nathan was no longer a shadow. It had materialized fully, its form taking on more definition with each passing moment. The blurry edges sharpened, revealing a tall, gaunt figure, its long limbs twisted at odd angles. Its eyes, or what Nathan could only assume were eyes, were two hollow voids that seemed to absorb all light, pulling everything into an endless dark. The figure's presence filled the room with an oppressive weight, as though reality itself was bending under its gaze. Nathan could feel the air growing colder, the walls around him pressing in tighter, as if the very space was being squeezed by some unseen force. Despite the terror that gripped him, Nathan's body refused to move. The whispers from before now felt like an insistent hum in the back of his mind, overwhelming in their urgency. "You must follow. The door is open. The way is clear." The voice sounded like his own, but foreign at the same time. It was not a suggestion, but an order, one that Nathan could not ignore, even if he wanted to. The realization dawned on him. The figure was not here to harm him, at least not in the way he had feared. It was not an enemy, it was a guide. Or at least, that's what the whispers implied. The figure's movements were unnerving, as though it didn't simply walk but slid through the air, each step a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to defy the very nature of human movement. It took a step forward, and the space around Nathan shimmered, warping in a way that made his head spin. The floor beneath his feet no longer felt solid. It was as if he were standing on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible. A wave of nausea swept over him, but he fought to keep his composure. He had no idea what this was, where he was, or what was happening, but he knew, deep in the pit of his stomach, that the time had come. He had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. His hand instinctively reached for the mark on his arm, the one that had been burned into his skin after the encounter in the Nexus room. It still pulsed with a dull, unnatural heat, as though it were connected to something far beyond his understanding. The figure gestured toward him, its long fingers elongating as if to beckon him forward. The room around him seemed to dissolve further, the edges blurring until there was nothing but the figure and the strange, otherworldly space that stretched out beyond it. Nathan hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. His heart raced, but there was no way to turn back. The figure's gesture was not one of invitation, it was a command, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself compelled to obey. The whispers intensified again, now surrounding him, filling every corner of his mind. "You are the key. The moment is here. You must walk through." Nathan's thoughts raced. What was this place? What was on the other side? There were no answers, only the overwhelming need to follow, to cross into whatever lay beyond the figure. He wasn't sure if he was afraid or if he was already beyond the point of fear. The boundary between the physical world and whatever this was had already been blurred. With a deep breath, Nathan stepped forward. The instant his foot left the solid ground of the room, the world around him shifted violently. The floor, the walls, everything seemed to fold inward, bending and twisting like a piece of paper being crumpled into a ball. The air became thick, almost gelatinous, and it was difficult to breathe, as though the very atmosphere was resisting his movement. But still he pressed on. The figure remained ahead, just out of reach, leading him deeper into the shifting, formless space. Time lost all meaning as Nathan moved through this strange, liminal space. It felt like hours, yet the passage of time was imperceptible. The figure was always there, just ahead, its silhouette a constant in the chaos of shifting shapes and sounds. The whispers, too, were constant, but their meaning became more cryptic as Nathan ventured further. Some words were familiar, others strange, ancient perhaps, or from some language he had never heard. Yet, through it all, there was one word that continued to echo over and over again in his mind. Nexus. Nexus. The word felt important, but he could not grasp its full meaning. His mind flailed, searching for context, for understanding, but it remained elusive. And then, All at once, the space around him seemed to snap into focus. The swirling, chaotic shapes solidified into something more tangible. A door, an archway that appeared suddenly in front of him, glowing with a pale, ethereal light. The figure paused in front of it, turning its hollow eyes toward Nathan. It was then that Nathan understood. The figure was not leading him to safety. It was guiding him to the next stage, the final moment of the journey. The door before him was not a passage to salvation, but to something far more dangerous. He had crossed into this otherworldly space for a reason, to unlock something, to fulfill a purpose. And this door, this nexus, was the final destination. The figure raised its hand once more, signaling for Nathan to approach. Despite the surge of fear that gripped him, Nathan took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no choice but to walk through the door, to face whatever lay beyond. It was the only way forward. He had crossed too far into this unknown world to turn back now. As Nathan reached the threshold of the door, the whispers ceased. The space around him grew unnervingly silent. He stood at the edge of something vast, something unknowable. The door loomed before him, its light flickering like a distant star. And in that moment, Nathan realized the truth. This was no longer just a journey into the unknown. It was a confrontation with his own fate. The crossing had begun, and there would be no turning back. As Nathan stepped through the threshold of the door, his senses were immediately assaulted by a rush of overwhelming sensations. His vision blurred, and his body felt weightless, as if suspended in an endless void. The silence that had surrounded him moments ago was replaced by an eerie hum, the sound vibrating through the air like the low, resonant frequency of some ancient machine. He felt as though his very atoms were vibrating in tune with it, an uncomfortable sensation that unsettled him on a primal level. The space he found himself in was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't a room or a place in any traditional sense. It was an endless expanse of darkness. Yet there was a strange, soft illumination that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as though the air itself were glowing, a dim, ethereal light that did not cast shadows. Nathan's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the environment, but there was nothing to focus on except the soft glow and the unceasing hum that filled the atmosphere. The figure, which had led him through the door, was now nowhere to be seen. For the first time, Nathan felt a profound sense of isolation. He was alone, completely alone, in a place where reality itself seemed to bend and shift with no pattern or logic. The walls, if they could even be called walls, stretched out infinitely in every direction, their surfaces smooth and featureless, as if they existed solely to contain this inexplicable emptiness. Nathan took a tentative step forward, his shoes making no sound on the invisible floor beneath him. Each movement felt unnatural, as though the very act of walking was out of place in this realm. It was difficult to gather his bearings, to process his surroundings. His mind raced to make sense of what was happening. But the more he thought, the more the questions piled up, spinning him into a vortex of confusion. What had he crossed into? What was the true nature of this place? And why had he been chosen? A soft, almost imperceptible voice broke through his thoughts, its tone faint and distant, like a whisper on the wind. Nathan, the voice was familiar, and for a moment, it sounded like his own. But as the words continued, it became clear that it wasn't. The answer lies within you. Nathan froze. The voice was not external. It wasn't coming from the air around him, but from within. It wasn't a thought. It was a revelation, a message directly implanted in his mind. His hand instinctively went to his head, as though trying to physically shield himself from the intrusion. But it didn't help. The voice continued, soft and insistent. You have always known, Nathan. You were never meant to be part of their world. Your journey was always destined to lead here, to this moment, to this place. He couldn't breathe. The weight of those words pressed against his chest, squeezing the air out of him. The idea that he had always known, that his entire life had been leading him to this very point, felt impossible. He couldn't accept it. He had spent his years at the university pursuing knowledge, a sense of purpose that had been his driving force. How could all of that have been for nothing? How could he, a mere student, be part of something greater, something so vast and incomprehensible? The Nexus was never just a door, Nathan. It is a crossroads, a meeting point of realities, of timelines, of possibilities. The moment you opened it, you unlocked a path that leads beyond the known. And now, you must choose. The choice. Nathan's mind reeled. He had been brought here, guided by some force he couldn't understand, to face a decision that transcended everything he had known. But what was the choice? What could he possibly decide in a place like this? His thoughts spiraled into panic. Was there a way out? Was there a way to reverse whatever had been set into motion? He had to understand. He needed to know what he was supposed to do. "I don't understand," he said aloud, his voice trembling. He had not meant to speak, but the words seemed to force their way out of him. "What is this? What am I supposed to do?" The voice did not answer directly. Instead, the light in the vast expanse around him shifted, subtly at first, then more dramatically. The air itself seemed to ripple, and before Nathan's eyes, a series of images began to materialize. They flickered like old film reels, showing glimpses of his life, his childhood, his time at the university, the people he had known. But there was something wrong with these images. They weren't exactly memories. They were versions of memories, fractured and twisted, as if they had been altered in some way. Some of the images showed him walking down familiar hallways at the university, but the faces of his friends and professors were distorted, their features warped, as if they were not quite human. In another vision, he saw himself sitting in a classroom, but the walls of the room bled away into nothingness, and the desks were overturned, as though something violent had happened. The images were unsettling, growing more disjointed with each passing second, until they became nothing more than a blur of motion and color. Finally, the images stopped, and the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through his bones. Nathan felt his heart race, the panic rising again in his chest. This wasn't just a journey through some metaphysical space. It was a journey through his own existence, through the choices he had made and the consequences of those choices. The truth of his life, the truth of this reality, was unraveling before him, piece by piece. "You are not who you think you are," the voice said softly. "You are not a student, not a mere traveler. You are a vessel, a point of convergence. The paths of the world are intertwined within you, and now you must decide which path to take. The Nexus does not grant you knowledge, it grants you power. The power to change reality itself." Nathan staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. He couldn't process it, not all of it. How could this be true? How could he, just one person, hold such power? Was everything he had experienced, everything he had believed in, just a construct? A lie? The voice fell silent for a moment, and Nathan was left alone in the vast expanse, the weight of its words pressing on him like an unbearable burden. He had been given a choice, but what did it mean? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? There was no clear path forward, only the haunting question of what lay beyond the door and whether he could ever return to the life he had once known. In the unnerving silence of the endless space, Nathan stood frozen, caught between the weight of the revelation and the growing anxiety that clenched at his chest. The vast, glowing expanse seemed to close in around him, as though the universe itself were folding, shifting, waiting for him to make his move. There was no comfort in the void, no solace in the empty air. He was alone, suspended in an infinite moment where time held no meaning. And yet, the implications of what he had just learned, of what the voice had told him, pulsed through him like an electric current, too powerful to ignore. The idea that he was something more than a student, that his life had been a mere preparation for something greater, felt alien to him. How could he reconcile the image of himself, the young man who had struggled with late-night exams, the hours spent in the library, the friendships formed over late-night coffee, with this new identity, the idea that he was a vessel, a point of convergence for realities and timelines? His mind rejected it. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Yet deep down, something in him felt an undeniable pull, a force that urged him to accept the truth, no matter how incomprehensible it seemed. The reality he had known, the world he had lived in, had been a thin veneer over something much larger, much more complex. But if this was true, if he were indeed a vessel of power, then what did that mean for the world around him? Could he truly change the course of reality? Could he control the future? Or perhaps, more frighteningly, unravel it? As the voice continued to resonate within him, Nathan felt his thoughts begin to spiral into chaos. The images that had flickered before him, the distorted, twisted versions of his memories, flashed back into his mind. He could still see the warping of faces, the shattered reflections of his own life. The past, it seemed, was not as it had appeared. Every moment, every choice, every interaction with the people he thought he knew was now tainted by doubt. He couldn't trust what he had seen, what he had experienced. Was any of it real? He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to him, gnawing at his sense of self. The weight of the realization, of the power that lay dormant within him, was suffocating. How could he control such power? What would happen if he didn't? What if by simply existing in this place, he was unknowingly tipping the balance of reality itself? The voice spoke again, softer this time, almost as if it were trying to calm him, to soothe his fraying nerves. Nathan, you must accept the truth. You have always had the power within you. The Nexus has shown you this. You are not bound by the same limitations as others. You are capable of more than you understand. The key is not to control the power, but to understand it. You must learn how to navigate the paths, how to weave the threads of fate. It was as if the voice was speaking directly to his deepest fears, to the uncertainty that had always lurked in the back of his mind. The notion of fate, of destiny, had always seemed like a distant, abstract concept to Nathan. He had believed in the randomness of life, the idea that people shape their own futures through choice and consequence. But this, what he was facing now, shattered that illusion completely. There was no such thing as randomness in this place, no free will to guide him. He was part of something far greater, a part of a story that had been written long before his first breath, long before he had even set foot on campus. "Who are you?" Nathan finally asked, his voice shaky with the enormity of his question. The words felt strange coming from his lips, as though they didn't belong to him. He had known, somewhere deep inside, that he had to ask, but it was terrifying to do so, to break the silence and demand answers. The voice, after all, had told him that it was not external, it was within him. So, who was speaking? Who was guiding him through this impossible journey? There was a long pause before the response came, the voice now taking on a more resonant, almost intimate quality. "I am the echo of the Nexus, Nathan. I am not a person, but an essence, a consciousness formed from the collective will of those who have crossed the threshold before you. I am here to guide you, to help you understand your place in this intricate weave of fate. You are not alone, though it may seem so. You have always been part of this story, even before you knew it." Nathan's mind reeled with the implications of this answer. An essence? A collective will? What did that even mean? He had hoped for clarity, for a sense of direction, but all he was getting were cryptic riddles that only deepened his confusion. Still, beneath the layers of fear and uncertainty, something else stirred, something that he had not fully recognized until now. A flicker of understanding, a recognition that this was his moment to make a choice. But what choice? What path would he take? The hum that had been present in the background grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the very air itself. Nathan felt the sensation surge through his body, each pulse pushing him closer to the precipice of a decision. Was he ready for this? Could he accept the truth, embrace the power that had been offered to him, and step into a role that transcended the life he had known? Another vision appeared before him, not a memory this time, but a scene that felt like a warning. It was a flash of the future, of a world unraveling, of destruction and chaos. He saw himself standing in the midst of it all, a silent observer, unable to change the course of events. Was this what awaited him if he failed to choose? Was this the consequence of inaction? The vision flickered and vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Nathan standing once more in the shifting darkness. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the decision pressing on him from all sides. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. Whatever path he chose, it would change everything. There was no going back now. The question was not whether he could control the power. He had to understand it first. The question was whether he was willing to face the truth, to accept the weight of his role in the grand design of the universe. Nathan stood at the precipice of his own existence, his body unmoving, but his mind a chaotic whirlwind. He could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on him, but it was not the kind of weight that could be ignored. It was a crushing burden, one that twisted at his very soul, forcing him to confront a reality that felt more like a nightmare than a chance for empowerment. The endless hum still vibrated around him, a constant reminder of the strange new world he had stepped into, where the rules of reality were no longer his to define. And now he was supposed to choose. The voice, his guide, his tormentor, or perhaps both, had laid out his future in broad, cryptic strokes. The Nexus, a term he still barely understood, had been revealed to him as a place, or perhaps an entity, that connected the threads of existence, the pathways of time, and the choices that defined the world. It was a place of power, where reality itself could be shaped, but only by those with the ability to see beyond the surface of things. Nathan's role in this complex weave was unclear, yet undeniably important. The task was simple. He needed to understand his place, to choose a path that would set in motion the threads of fate. But the decision was anything but simple. As the days passed, the weight of this knowledge grew heavier. At first, Nathan had hoped that the answers would come, that he would find a way to unlock the mysteries surrounding him. But the more he tried to grasp at the elusive threads of his understanding, the more they slipped through his fingers. It wasn't a matter of lack of effort. No, he had thrown himself into this new existence with a fervor, reading every text he could find, meditating on every vision, listening intently to the disembodied voice that had become his only contact with the universe beyond the campus. Yet still, answers were nowhere to be found. And as the moments stretched into hours and hours into days, Nathan began to feel the creeping sense of isolation. Despite the connection he felt to the Nexus, despite the knowledge that others like him had crossed this threshold before, he was utterly alone. There was no one to guide him, no one to tell him what to do next. The weight of his choices was his alone to bear, and with each passing moment, he felt it grow more unbearable. Perhaps the worst part of all was the uncertainty. What did the future hold? Would embracing his destiny, whatever it might be, save the world or destroy it? The vision he had seen, the world on the brink of collapse, seemed to be a warning. It was as though the fabric of reality itself were trembling, threatened by the very presence of people like him, those who could shape fate. Could such power be contained? Could it be used for good? Or would it be the thing that unraveled everything? It was an irony Nathan couldn't ignore. All his life, he had believed in choice, the power of individual decisions to shape one's path. The idea that he could control his own future, that he could rise above the mundane and make something of himself, had been at the core of his identity. But now, standing at the crossroads of fate itself, he realized that the very notion of free will was an illusion. There was no such thing as a simple choice here. Each option, each path, was fraught with consequences too vast to comprehend. And the more he tried to understand, the more elusive the truth became. The voice, ever present, whispered again, its tone patient yet urgent. Nathan, the time is approaching. The threads of reality grow thinner with every passing moment. You must decide. The future is waiting. But what future? Nathan couldn't shake the images of the future he had seen. Destruction, chaos, a world teetering on the brink of annihilation. He had seen glimpses of a shattered reality, war-torn landscapes, dying cities, and people running in fear from something they couldn't even see. The voice had been cryptic in its warnings, but the implications were clear. His choices, or his indecision, would be the catalyst for a series of events that could change everything. It was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about fate and free will. Was he truly in control, Or was he merely a pawn in a game far bigger than he could fathom? The more Nathan thought about it, the more he realized how terrifying the weight of this knowledge really was. This wasn't just about him anymore. His decisions would affect the lives of everyone he knew, everyone he loved. His choices could determine whether the world lived or died, whether humanity could continue to exist in the fragile balance they had created, or whether it would collapse into oblivion. But there was also something else, a strange stirring deep within him, an almost primal instinct that urged him to choose, to act. It was the part of him that understood the importance of agency, of taking control of his fate. He had always believed that the future could be shaped by willpower, by determination. But was that belief still valid in this new reality? Could he truly change the course of things? Or was he just a cog in a machine that had been set in motion long before he ever arrived? The more he struggled with these questions, the more they seemed to multiply, branching off into countless possibilities, each one more complex than the last. There were no easy answers here, no simple solutions. There was only the weight of his choices and the crushing uncertainty of what might come next. In the end, Nathan knew that he could not avoid the decision any longer. The nexus, the force that had brought him here, was pushing him forward, urging him to embrace the unknown. His fear, his hesitation, they were natural, yes, but they could not hold him back. If he was ever to understand his place in this grand design, he would have to make the leap, to choose a path, to step forward into the unknown. But even as he steeled himself for that moment, a deep, gnawing fear settled in his chest. For the first time, Nathan understood the true meaning of responsibility. It was not simply about shaping the future. It was about bearing the consequences, whatever they might be. And in that moment, the future no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a heavy, unwieldy weight, one that he had no choice but to carry. Nathan's decision came not as a flash of clarity, but as a slow and inevitable acceptance. He had no choice but to move forward. His footsteps were shaky, but they carried him in the direction he knew he must go, towards the nexus, the source of everything and nothing. It was a paradox, something so integral to the world, yet so intangible, like the shifting fog of a dream that could never be grasped, only experienced. But even as he approached the threshold of the unknown, a new wave of fear gripped him, colder and more unsettling than anything he had encountered so far. The nexus, as it was described to him, was not merely a place. It was not simply an intersection of paths or a link between realities. It was a rupture in the very fabric of existence. What Nathan had once believed to be immutable truths, time, space, even death itself, were now up for question. He was no longer in the realm of linear progression, where actions led to outcomes, and where time moved like a river in one direction. No, in the Nexus, those rules no longer applied. In fact, he had come to realize that time was a fragile construct, one that could be warped, folded, or even shattered altogether. The very notion of cause and effect had begun to unravel in his mind. Yet, it wasn't just the idea of temporal manipulation that disturbed Nathan. It was the overwhelming sense of disorientation he felt every time he ventured into this strange space. The air around him seemed to warp with each breath, shifting between moments of clarity and disintegration. One moment, he would be standing in a classroom he recognized from his college days. The next, a vast, empty void, stretching into eternity. He had seen the world fracturing before him, like glass splintering under pressure, but what unnerved him most was how real it all felt. The edges of his surroundings, whether familiar or alien, were sharp, jagged, impossible to ignore. This instability, Nathan had come to realize, was not an accident. It was the very essence of the Nexus. It was what allowed it to be both a source of power and a weapon of destruction. Every step Nathan took in this space felt like it pushed him further into the unknown, away from the tethered reality he had known. And yet he was compelled to continue. If the Nexus was truly the key to the future, the crossroads of fate, then it was his responsibility to unlock its mysteries, no matter how it twisted the world around him. In some strange way, It felt as though the Nexus was testing him. Not just testing his resolve or his ability to understand, but testing the very limits of his mind. Every time he thought he understood one part of the riddle, another layer would unfold, revealing even more contradictions. It was as though the Nexus was alive, aware of his every move, watching him as he stumbled through its chaotic labyrinth. And yet, despite the mind-bending complexity of it all, Nathan felt a strange sense of purpose. His place in this intricate web was becoming clearer, or so he thought. But with each revelation, there was also a deeper question. Was he in control, or was he being guided by something much more powerful than himself? The more he explored, the more the lines between reality and illusion blurred. He began to notice things that felt like echoes of other lives, visions of people he had never met, places he had never been, and events that had never occurred. At first, he had thought these were mere hallucinations, the product of his overstimulated mind. But the more they repeated, the more he began to suspect something else. The Nexus was showing him possible futures, alternate realities, or perhaps fragments of the very choices he had yet to make. It was as though the space was inextricably connected to his mind, feeding off his thoughts and desires, pulling him into the very crossroads of his existence. But the deeper he went, the more unsettling the experience became. There were moments when he felt like an intruder, like his presence was disturbing the delicate balance of things. He had seen the cracks in the world, but now he was starting to feel them. His actions seemed to reverberate through time, leaving ripples that spread out of control. Each choice he made felt like it could alter the course of reality itself, with consequences that were far beyond his understanding. It was as though the Nexus had granted him immense power, but it also cursed him with the burden of knowing just how fragile everything truly was. It was during one of these moments of doubt that he heard the voice again. It had become a constant companion in his journey, though its words were no longer as reassuring as before. This time, the voice was different, colder, its tone almost mournful. "Nathan," it intoned, "you are approaching the point of no return. The fracture has already begun. There is no turning back." Those words echoed in his mind long after they had faded from the air. The fracture, he understood now that it wasn't a metaphor. Reality itself was being torn apart. The Nexus, it seemed, had been put in place not to preserve the world, but to preserve the balance between worlds. If that balance was upset, if the threads of fate were pulled too far in one direction, everything would fall. The dreamlike distortions he had experienced were not just the result of his mind unraveling. They were symptoms of a much larger cosmic disruption. Nathan realized that he was standing at the center of a storm that threatened not only his world, but countless others. The paradox, the horrific truth, was clear now. He was both the problem and the solution. The very act of him trying to understand and control the Nexus was what had caused the fracture in the first place. By seeking to control reality, he had disturbed its natural flow. Now, the only way to stop the chaos was to surrender, to stop resisting the force that had brought him here. But was that truly the answer? Could he accept his role as an observer, as a passive participant in a universe that was far beyond his comprehension? Or was there another way, a path he had yet to see, that could restore balance without completely relinquishing his agency? The answers were elusive as always. And as Nathan stood there, at the edge of the Nexus, the weight of his decision became unbearable. The fracture in reality was not something that could be ignored. It was only a matter of time before the world would break. And as the air around him shifted, Nathan could only wonder, could the fracture ever truly be healed? Or was this, the unraveling of everything he had known, inevitable? The burden of knowing what was at stake, the potential collapse of not only his world but countless others, was not one Nathan could simply ignore. He had always prided himself on making decisions quickly, believing that there was little value in hesitation, that speed often held the key to success. Yet here in the Nexus, where time twisted and reality itself teetered on the brink of collapse, there was no room for rashness. Every choice he made now seemed to carry the weight of entire universes. The paths ahead were unclear, fractured, But in their uncertainty lay the only hope of restoring the balance he had inadvertently shattered. Nathan stood at the threshold of a choice, yet it felt less like a decision and more like a suffocating inevitability. The Nexus had placed him in this position, but now, as the rumblings of reality's collapse reverberated around him, it seemed as though his choices were slipping away, leaving him with nothing but fragments of possibilities. The more he tried to focus, the less tangible everything became. The air, the very space around him, flickered like the static on an old television screen. It was as though the universe itself was blinking in and out of existence, just as his certainty seemed to vanish. What struck him most, however, was the revelation that the Nexus wasn't just a conduit for cosmic power. It was a reflection of human consciousness itself. He had believed that his understanding of the Nexus could be gained through logic, through careful study. But the more he dove into its depths, the more he realized that it didn't operate on reason. It was driven by desire, by fear, by the things unspoken and the choices left behind. It was a manifestation of everything that had been repressed, hidden in the unconscious corners of the mind. This was not a place for cold calculation. The Nexus thrived on emotion, and it was from this very rawness that the fractures had originated. In that moment, Nathan could see it clearly. The Nexus was not simply something that needed to be fixed, it needed to be understood. The reality that had begun to warp around him was not the result of an external force trying to break the world apart. It was the result of an imbalance within himself. The layers of existence were crumbling not because of an external invader, but because of the contradictions within his own psyche. It was as though the Nexus was reflecting his inner turmoil, magnifying the fractures of his soul until they had become a reflection of the physical world around him. The more Nathan thought about this, the more he felt a creeping sense of despair. If the Nexus was a reflection of his own internal world, then what could he possibly do to fix it? How could he hope to restore balance when his mind was itself fractured? His doubts, his fears, and his unresolved desires had somehow fed into the very energy of the Nexus, creating the conditions for its collapse. If he were to heal the Nexus, then it seemed that he first had to face his own fractured identity. His personal history, the mistakes he had made, the choices he had avoided, had become inextricably linked with the world itself. The idea that the Nexus was a mirror of his own inner world gave him little comfort. In fact, it only deepened his sense of isolation. He had always thought of himself as someone who could move forward without looking back, but now it was clear that his past was a part of him, inextricably woven into the fabric of the present. The failures, the regrets, the relationships he had let slip through his fingers. All of these moments had accumulated, festering in the shadows of his mind, feeding the instability of the Nexus. He had been running from them for years, but now it was impossible to ignore. The weight of his own existence was pressing in on him, forcing him to confront everything he had tried to forget. Yet, as overwhelming as this revelation was, there was something strangely liberating about it. If the Nexus was a reflection of his internal struggles, then perhaps the solution was not to manipulate the Nexus or to wrestle with its power. Perhaps instead, the key to restoring balance lay within himself. Perhaps, by healing the fractures in his own psyche, he could reverse the chaos he had unleashed. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the first real hope he had felt in what seemed like forever. The possibility that he could heal the Nexus, not through external force, but through self-understanding, was something he had not considered until now. This path was not an easy one. In fact, it felt like the hardest thing he could ever do. To face his past, to confront the aspects of himself he had tried to bury, would require not just courage, but the willingness to accept the full weight of his failures. The Nexus was not offering him a quick fix. It was offering him an opportunity for deep, personal transformation. But transformation was never without pain. To face the shadows of his past was to risk shattering the carefully constructed identity he had built over the years. As he considered this, Nathan began to feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The very fabric of reality was shifting with every thought he had, every decision he made. If he chose to confront his past, to face the fractured parts of himself, he would not only be healing the Nexus, but he would be forever changed. It was a daunting realization. Would the cost of saving the world be too high? Could he bear the weight of this personal evolution, knowing that every step he took could fracture him further? The answer was unclear, as it always was, but one thing had become undeniable. The Nexus was offering him a chance for redemption, not just for the world, but for himself. Whether he took it or not would depend on whether he was willing to face the darkest parts of his soul. The fractures in reality could not be mended with simple actions or grand gestures. They required understanding, a deep and unflinching acceptance of all that he had been, all that he had done, and all that he had yet to become. In this moment, Nathan realized that the real battle was not against the Nexus, but against himself. The choice had always been his. As Nathan stood at the edge of understanding, staring into the abyss of his own fractured psyche, a deep unease settled over him. It was as though the very fabric of his being had been stretched too thin, ready to tear apart under the weight of his own thoughts. The Nexus, with all its power and complexity, had revealed a profound truth. To save the world, he would first have to save himself. But this realization did little to ease the storm brewing inside him. The task before him felt insurmountable, as if the universe itself was conspiring against his every attempt at self-repair. The problem, Nathan realized, was not just the past he had been running from, but the future that loomed over him, ever uncertain and ever threatening. His entire life had been defined by a need for control, an impulse to chart his course with absolute precision. Yet here, in the Nexus, in the depths of his mind, control seemed like a distant illusion. He could not simply fix his past. He could not simply manipulate time or space to reverse the damage he had done. Instead, he had to confront the deep and terrifying truth that there were no guarantees, no certainty. To heal, he had to surrender his need for control. This loss of control was both liberating and terrifying. As a young man, Nathan had always been the picture of confidence. He knew where he was going, how to get there, and who he needed to become to achieve his goals. But now, standing on the precipice of self-awareness, he found himself without a map. His mind, once clear and determined, was now clouded by doubt and fear. Each choice he made seemed to send ripples of uncertainty through the Nexus, changing things in ways he couldn't predict, let alone control. The more he tried to force a solution, the more everything seemed to fall apart. Nathan began to understand that the Nexus, like his mind, was a system of interconnected variables. Every choice, every action, and every thought led to new paths, new possibilities. But unlike a mathematical equation, there was no right answer here. The Nexus didn't reward the predictable. It thrived on chaos, on uncertainty, on the unpredictable nature of human consciousness. It was as if the universe itself had become aware of Nathan's struggle, feeding off his confusion, feeding off his doubts. His attempts to impose order only seemed to provoke more disorder. But there was something else in the air now, a strange sense of clarity. The more Nathan allowed himself to acknowledge his own vulnerability, the more the Nexus seemed to shift. He could almost feel the boundaries of reality bending, reshaping with every breath he took. In this chaotic, uncertain space, he realized that the solution wasn't to fight the forces at play. It wasn't to try to restore balance by manipulating the forces of the Nexus. It was to embrace them, to recognize that the very chaos that threatened to tear him apart was also the force that could rebuild him, stronger than before. Yet despite this revelation, Nathan struggled to let go. The fear of complete surrender was a heavy weight around his chest, suffocating him with its intensity. What if, by embracing the chaos, he lost himself entirely? What if he ceased to exist as the person he thought he was? The terror of dissolution, of losing the self that had guided him through life, was a fear that was difficult to shake. But in the silence that followed this thought, Nathan realized that he was not losing himself. He was allowing a new version of himself to emerge. The person he had been was no longer enough for the person he was becoming. The Nexus, Nathan now understood, was a living organism, not a machine to be fixed or controlled. It was a mirror of the universe itself, chaotic and ever-shifting, alive with possibility. By trying to impose his will upon it, Nathan had only deepened the divide between himself and the world around him. But by letting go, by accepting the chaos within himself and within the Nexus, he could become a part of something much larger. This was not about mastery or dominance. It was about integration. To heal, he needed to become one with the forces at play, to accept his role within the greater web of existence. The act of surrender was not a passive one. Nathan understood that fully now. It required immense strength to relinquish control, to trust in the unknown. He had spent his entire life seeking answers, finding security in certainty. But now, in the very heart of the Nexus, he realized that there were no simple answers. There were only experiences, moments of clarity intertwined with moments of darkness. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the solution lay not in knowing what would happen next, but in trusting that whatever came, he could face it. In this acceptance, Nathan felt a strange lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The constant pressure to fix, to control, to ensure that every move was perfect had begun to fade. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he could breathe again, as though the chains of his past, his fears, and his doubts had loosened their grip. He didn't need to know what would happen next. He didn't need to have every answer. He simply needed to be present, to step forward into the uncertainty with the knowledge that he was capable of facing whatever came. But there was no time to linger in this newfound peace. The Nexus, while shifting and evolving, was still unstable. The collapse had not yet reached its peak, and the universe was teetering on the edge of annihilation. Nathan knew that he couldn't simply stand still, waiting for answers to come. His choice, his acceptance, had opened the door to a new possibility, but now he needed to act. The final piece of the puzzle was not to understand the Nexus fully, but to trust in himself and in the choices he had made. The path forward was unknown, but it was the only one left. With a steady breath, Nathan took the first step into the void. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or the ultimate act of defiance that saved Nathan. It was the quiet surrender to the flow of existence. In the Nexus, where time and space twisted like ribbons of light, he had finally come to understand the one truth that had eluded him for so long. Control was an illusion. It was not about shaping the future or fixing the past. It was about embracing the present, accepting the uncertainties, and learning to flow with the very chaos that had once threatened to consume him. Nathan's final choice was not one of defiance, nor was it one of submission. It was a choice to exist in harmony with the world around him, to allow himself to be swept up in the current of time without the need to dictate where it would lead. This understanding came to him slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Nexus, once a place of overwhelming power and mystery, had now become a space of quiet revelation. The frantic energy that had surged through him during his earlier struggles had calmed, replaced by a profound stillness. And it was in this stillness that he found his clarity. He could feel the forces at play, the pull of the Nexus as it shifted, bending reality to its will. Yet instead of fighting against it, he chose to surrender. It wasn't about giving up. It was about giving in. It was about accepting that he was not the center of the universe, but rather a small part of a vast, interconnected web of existence. The realization was humbling, but it also brought with it a deep sense of peace. The chaos he had once feared now seemed almost beautiful in its complexity, a natural part of the rhythm of life. He no longer sought to control it. He allowed it to guide him. The decision to let go did not come easily. Nathan had spent his life pursuing mastery over his environment, shaping his destiny with a precision that bordered on obsession. The idea of surrendering to forces beyond his understanding had been terrifying. Yet, in the quiet moments that followed his decision, he felt a deep connection to something greater than himself. The weight of responsibility, which had once burdened him, seemed to lift. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. Not free from consequences, but free to live without the crushing pressure of always having to make the right choice. But this freedom was not without its consequences. As he embraced the flow of the Nexus, Nathan could feel the instability around him intensify. The world he had known was beginning to crumble, the fractures growing deeper. The collapse that had threatened to undo everything was drawing nearer, and Nathan knew that the moment of reckoning was upon him. Yet, rather than panic, he simply allowed himself to be present. The future, with all its uncertainties, no longer filled him with dread. He had come to understand that no amount of planning, no amount of force could control the ultimate outcome. What mattered was how he faced it. The Nexus, as it shifted around him, seemed to recognize Nathan's acceptance. It responded not with more chaos, but with a gentle unfolding, as though the very fabric of reality was realigning itself to accommodate his newfound understanding. The forces that had once felt alien and threatening now seemed almost familiar, as though they were responding to his willingness to be part of something larger than himself. He no longer felt like an outsider fighting against the current. He was the current. He was the flow. The world around him, the university, the city, the very fabric of existence, seemed to pulse with life, each beat echoing the rhythm of his own heart. It was as if time itself had become a living thing, no longer a rigid progression, but a fluid dance of moments that existed all at once. The Nexus, once an abstract concept, had become a tangible reality, one that he was no longer separate from. He was one with it, and it was one with him. But as the final reckoning approached, Nathan knew that his journey wasn't just about him. The Nexus was not a personal battle, nor was it a game to be won. It was a cosmic force, a reflection of the interconnectedness of all things. His choice to embrace the chaos, to accept his place within it, had set into motion a chain of events that would affect not only him, but the entire world. The future was no longer an individual pursuit. It was a collective experience, a shared journey that would unfold with every breath, every choice, every action. The final test, Nathan understood now, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet resolution. It was the acceptance of the inevitable, the acknowledgement that life was as much about surrender as it was about action. He had fought for so long, struggling to impose his will on the universe. But the true power lay not in dominance, but in the ability to flow with the currents, to accept the unknown with grace. And as he stood in the heart of the Nexus, facing the collapse of the world he had known, he realized that this was his final lesson: to be at peace with the uncertainty, to embrace the void with open arms, and to trust that whatever came next, he would be ready. In that moment, as the Nexus reached its peak of instability, Nathan felt a shift, an understanding that transcended the need for control, transcended the fear of what was to come. He was no longer just a person navigating a universe of chaos. He had become part of the chaos itself, a living expression of the universe's ever-evolving dance. And as the world trembled on the brink of collapse, Nathan stepped forward, not into the void, but into a new beginning.